Hello, my name is Justine and I'm with the Ring of Democracy. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was started back in 2016, and we are here to educate, engage, organize, and mobilize Black and Brown communities, specifically marginalized communities overall. And one way we are doing that is by holding these conversations with candidates who are running for local and congressional seats. And today we have here with us, thank you so much for joining us, Chris Bennett, who is running for a congressional seat, District 3. And yeah, thank you so much for coming in and jumping into the Ring of Democracy with us.
Happy to be here.
Great. And if you want to share a little bit about your background and why you decided to run for this position.
Sure. So my name is Chris Bennett, and I'm a People First, corporate-free, disabled Army veteran, a West Point and Berkeley grad, and someone who's running to challenge for the 3rd District House seat in the United States House of Representatives, which covers everywhere from Southeast Sacramento all the way north and east to Truckee and South Lake Tahoe. I decided to run for Congress because I swore an oath to the Constitution when I became an Army artillery officer, and that meant to protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And after the second Trump election, I was sitting in my office and decided that my red line was if people started getting kidnapped off the street. And that started happening last April to immigrant students when ICE agents started going after them for protesting genocide. So I quit my job to run for Congress because it really is the decisive point of our democracy, with the power to impeach, the power of the purse, and the power to fix our broken system so it actually works for everyday people. So that's what got me into the race, and what keeps me going is the amazing connections and community that we've built with people throughout the district, including before Prop 50 and after Prop 50, which changed things a lot.
I see. All right, so thank you so much. Jumping right into it, you spoke about ICE and the treatment of young students here in the United States. Immigration continues to be a complex and often divisive issue. How do you approach immigration reform, and what policies would you prioritize?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest problems with our immigration system is that it was designed badly from the start. What led to the current version that we have was a wave of anti-Chinese racism in the late 1800s that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So before that, it was basically open borders, right? You know, bring me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry. You know, you check in at Ellis Island, they maybe change your name, and then you'd go about your business. Ever since the late 1800s, it's been more about trying to keep people out who we didn't like, as opposed to actually making it easier for people to immigrate here. So for me, it's really about trying to prioritize humane immigration policy. Right now, because we have an exclusion in the Constitution when we abolish slavery, that means that if you've been convicted of a crime, you can still be enslaved. We have a situation where private prisons are allowed to exist, and that's one of the reasons why ICE agents have been kidnapping some of the hardest working people in our country, day laborers outside of Home Depots. They send them to these private prison camps, they force them to do slave labor, and then they funnel that money back into the administration. So for me, it's really about undoing the harms and damages of our current immigration system, making it easier for people to come live and work here, making sure that we have common sense pathways to citizenship, and making sure that we actually have the workforce that we need to accomplish everything that needs to be done for our democracy, rather than putting people into cages or splitting up families. Because what we're doing right now is not humane, and it does not make any sense if you're actually going about it with moral clarity and having some kind of common sense.
I definitely see that point. And on the topic, when it comes to job creation and economic opportunity for those that were born here or those that are coming in, they are still central issues either way. How would you work to create good paying jobs and ensure economic mobility for working people?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different things. I have a Master of Business Administration from UC Berkeley, so I actually understand economics, and I can tell you that trickle down does not work. What actually does work is creating a rising tide that lifts all boats. So some things that I support are passing the PRO Act, making it easier for organized labor to actually organize, to have stronger bargaining powers, and to crack down on companies doing union-busting behaviors. I also support a federal jobs guarantee, similar to what we had with the New Deal, but in addition to that, like a Green New Deal. Because last year, we only created like 130,000 jobs across the entire country, but more than 1.2 million people became old enough to enter the workforce. So one of the frightening questions that I often get asked when people find out I'm running for Congress is not, what party are you in, what do you believe in, but are you hiring? Because there's just not enough jobs to go around. And when things like rent and food and childcare and healthcare are all tied to your employment, if people can't find jobs, then people are basically going homeless and hungry. So I think that's one of the biggest things that we need, a federal jobs guarantee that would also solve the issues we currently have of starvation wages. Now, I graduated from high school in 2008, and the federal minimum wage has not changed since then. So if wages had kept up with productivity since like the 1950s or 60s, people would be making anywhere from like 30 to 50 bucks an hour. And right now, here in Sacramento and the California areas, a lot of people are making anywhere from like $12 to $15, which is not enough to afford to live anywhere. So I think that we need to make it easier for people to find jobs. We need to make sure they have good paying union jobs. We need to strengthen organized labor. And we also just need to make it so things that are basic needs are not able to have a gigantic profit motive inserted between the people that need them and the people that are providing them. So I also support things like universal health insurance because it's cheaper for everyone and it has better outcomes. I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing to make it easier for people to afford to live here, but it starts with recognizing what the problem is and the fact that every single person needs these things, and that's what we should be prioritizing.
Certainly. And on that note of healthcare, access to affordable healthcare is a major concern for a lot of folks. What is your approach to improving healthcare access and affordability in your district?
Yeah, so I support single payer health insurance, which means that there is one payer for all health insurance programs. Most common one is Medicare for All, which I support. But I also think we need to make sure that healthcare includes vision, hearing, and dental, because if you talk to someone, they're going to tell you that if I can't eat, if there's something wrong with my teeth, that is my health, that is going to be affected. I think we need to rein in big pharma companies, because right now they're charging outrageous prices because they always have to increase their shareholder value. I think we need to ban direct-to-patient advertising for big pharma. I think we need to cap profits earned on drugs that received any taxpayer funding. And I think we need to dramatically expand the healthcare workforce. One thing that has happened recently is they've capped how much student loans people can take when they're trying to go to, for example, medical school, which makes it so that people who live in lower income communities who don't have as much access to wealth in order to pay for these colleges are just unable to become doctors. And that is going to dramatically shrink our workforce, which is going to have huge negative downstream impacts. But besides that, I also think that we need to have federally managed and owned hospitals, because one of the big problems we're facing is rural hospitals are at risk of getting shut down. And a lot of the centrist and corporate ideas for addressing this are, oh, let's tie getting health care in like a well-populated area like a city to having to provide it in a rural area. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because when it comes down to it, they're always going to try and cut costs and increase revenue, which means that the rural hospitals will always be behind. So I think we need to actually have a federal program to build, maintain, and sustain hospitals, whether that be in rural areas or in underserved areas within, for example, inner cities. Because right now there are, I think it's like 80-something hospitals that are at risk of closing in California alone because of the cuts to Medicaid. So we need to do something about that. And I feel like everyone should have access to high quality care, regardless of how far away you live to a big city.
And on that point that you spoke on about the tuition loan limits, you have advocated for tuition-free medical schools, and I was curious where you would suggest the funding come from for programs like that.
Yeah, so I think we should be investing in our future. Right now we're spending $1.5 trillion or more on the US military. I can tell you that that's not going to the troops, because when I was an Army captain, I had troops that were living on food stamps in black mold infested barracks, and we couldn't even service our own equipment because we had to call some guy in a pickup truck to come and fix it for us. So we have the money for it. We've also given ICE $70 billion to brutalize our communities and do everything that is horrible and happening right now. So we have the money for these programs. But in my mind, if we're not investing in education, then we're not investing in our future. And one of the worst things that came about from, for example, President Nixon's administration and President Reagan's administration was the idea that if you want to get an education, we need to shackle you to endless debt. Because that means that people can't actually focus on the things that they could have a bigger impact on. You have to go and get a job that will give you enough money to pay off your debt. So in my mind, it should be taxpayer funded, and we also just need to increase taxes on the ultra wealthy and billionaires, because they're getting benefits from society, but they're not paying into it, and we need to change that. So there's plenty of funding for it, but we have a lot of very real problems that we're facing, like climate change, like the problems of lithium-ion batteries exploding when we're trying to store energy from solar panels, for example. All of those are things we need research into, and that's something that can only really happen if we actually have an educated workforce.
Certainly. And for those that may already be in the workforce, those who already own a home or maybe are prospective buyers, housing affordability is a major challenge in many communities. What federal solutions would you support to address housing costs and availability?
Oh, so many things. I support public housing development, so having like federal workforce able to actually build multifamily dwellings. I support public financing for low and middle income housing, because I can tell you as a business school graduate, real estate developers know it is far more profitable to have a luxury apartment that's half full than to have a lower middle income apartment that's completely full. So if they're not going to be able to provide it, whether because they don't want to or because they can't afford it, then that's the entire reason we have a government in the first place. I support homelessness prevention solutions and having more shelters for homeless people. I think that we need to also have public insurance when it comes to like floods and fires. Specifically, it needs to be paid for by the biggest polluters, because climate change is real and it's leading to more and more wildfires and floods that are especially affecting people in the rural areas of the district and throughout the country. They're the least likely to be responsible for it, and when we put a fine on these companies, they just absorb it as a cost of doing business. So once they start having to pay for people's houses to be rebuilt, that will actually be the incentive they need to start finding alternative solutions and stop creating more climate change. Besides that, I also think that we really just need to make it so that people who are lower and middle income can afford upgrades and things like solar energy panels, right? Like right now we have programs that are helpful, but it's still like tens of thousands of dollars, and people who are low and middle income just can't afford them. So we focus on the jobs, we focus on health insurance, we focus on people's basic needs, and we also focus on building more housing. And I think one of the most ambitious things that I want to do is a civil service home loan, similar to the VA loan, where you can get a federally backed loan if you've done anything beneficial for society, so you don't have to put a down payment. You know, one of the biggest ways that military veterans have economic mobility is that we have a VA loan. So you can buy a house without having to put a down payment. But most people who are renters, especially like millennials and Gen Z, we want to buy a house, and they say, all right, you just need to fork up $150,000 or $200,000. And it's just not tenable. But we're able to afford it because we're having to pay our rent every single month. So it makes no sense that the only people who can get access to that kind of loan are veterans. I think teachers, social workers, bus drivers, people who are doing something directly beneficial to others should have the exact same kind of economic opportunity.
Definitely. And what role does corporate and foreign speculative ownership play when it comes to how the federal government needs to step in on this issue?
Yeah, so housing is a basic human need, and I believe housing should be a human right. And one of the problems that we have is that companies like BlackRock and Blackstone, for example, are buying up a lot of single-family homes. And we cannot compete with a giant private equity firm. And we also know that a lot of countries have people with a lot of wealth that they want to launder and store offshore, for example, from China or Russia or even North Korea, for example. And so what they'll do is they'll create these funneling like middlemen brokers in order to buy properties here in the US, and then no one's living in them, which also is artificially constraining the housing supply. So I think that we need to ban corporate and foreign speculative ownership, especially of single-family homes, because we should not be having to compete with people who are laundering their money from foreign countries. We should not be making it so that people who don't live here and don't have to have a home here are able to buy our properties. And we also need to make it so that corporations can't turn us all into their tenants so that they are just the world's biggest landlord. Because part of the American dream was that you can own your own home with a little white picket fence and have 2.1 children or something, right? But we can't do that if we're having to compete with private equity money.
Certainly. And coming back to that American dream concept, how do you plan to ensure that historically underserved communities, including Black, Brown, and working class communities, have equitable access to opportunities and resources?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can do, but we need to bring back DEI programs. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The whole point of it was to prevent unlawful discrimination against protected classes, not just a blanket catch-all for culture war issues. So that means making sure that we're getting rid of the historical effects of redlining, where Black people were unable to get access to home loans, for example. We also need to end the strange connection between property values and education funding, because that means that we know if you are living in an area that's predominantly lower income or predominantly people of color, they tend to have lower home prices, which means that they get lower funding for their schools. And then if you live in a white area, then you get much more funding for your schools because you have much higher property values. That does not make any sense to me. In my mind, it's just a maintenance of the historical segregation that we had in this country prior to the Civil Rights Act. I think that we need to also just expand access to everything. When it comes to, for example, medical care, we need to have more healthcare workers that actually reflect the communities that they're supposed to serve. That means that we need to have more people from Black and brown communities able to actually go to medical school or actually able to become doctors and nurses. We also need to make sure that we're doing research in such a way that's actually empirical and evidence-based, because we know that there's still a lot of doctors today who think that Black people and brown people have higher pain tolerance thresholds, and Black women have extremely high mortality rates because a lot of the time their concerns are ignored. So we just need to be focusing on actually leveling the playing field and making up for the historic harms that have been caused to these communities because of our systems of racism, apartheid, and genocide that led to our country's founding, but that still persist to this day in the outcomes that they had.
Certainly. And to hone in a little bit more on a specific zone, I know you've been talking about a lot of overarching issues when it comes to issues that the country is facing. What do you believe are the top 3 issues facing your district right now, and how do you plan to address them if elected?
Absolutely. So I think affordability obviously is one of the biggest ones, whether that's housing, groceries, childcare, health insurance, education. A lot of people just can't afford to meet their basic needs. I do think housing is honestly its own as well, because we just don't have enough housing units for people to live in. And I traditionally have gone out every other week and served meals to our unhoused neighbors downtown, and it feels like every single week there's more and more people there. And we know that the biggest source of homelessness or the biggest way that homelessness actually appears is not people living on the street, but people living in like extended stay hotels or crashing on someone's couch. So that's a huge problem. One of the biggest issues people bring up in Sacramento is can't afford housing and homelessness. And I think the last one is just making sure that we have basic human rights and are not funding endless unjust forever wars and genocides and the secret police attacking and brutalizing our neighbors. Those are, I think, the biggest issues that are on people's minds right now. Basic needs, the ability to actually live where you work, and knowing that our taxes aren't going to hurting us or people in other countries. And in terms of how we're going to address them, I've already talked about a lot of it, but I think we should be prioritizing basic needs. I think that needs to come first. I think we should be making sure that companies can't make money off of starting endless unjust conflicts and wars in foreign countries. And we also just need to make sure that we're using common sense and moral clarity when it comes to the policies that we're actually passing in DC.
Certainly. And when it comes to those basic needs, childcare is certainly one of them, if you want to speak on any specifics. And then we will wrap up and you can make your final statement.
Absolutely. So I think most of us understand that our current system is not designed for us. It's designed for people who have $1 billion or more, people who are getting paid off by those people, and the people that happen to serve those people because, they were born into like a yacht building family. But most people are really struggling right now. And I know that when it comes down to it, what every single person generally cares about first is there food in my belly? Is there a roof over my head? Do I feel safe in my community? And do I feel hopeful for my kids' future? Those things are at risk right now. Now, I would not be running for office if I didn't think that our future is in jeopardy if we don't do something about it now. So I think that we need to actually just focus on going back to the basics, focusing on making sure everyone has food in their belly, making sure everyone has a home that they can live in, that we are hopeful for the future, that our kids can come home safely from school. I think these are all things that we generally agree with if we're not being paid to believe otherwise. So I think from an affordability perspective, we know that there's an economic concept called average propensity to consume that shows if you prioritize money for people at the bottom of the income and wealth distribution, they tend to spend it. They spend it immediately. They spend it at small businesses, and that money circulates more and leads to more wealth generation in local economies, which is just better for everyone. It leads to stronger communities, and it's also better for economic growth overall. So I think those are some of the main ones.
Thank you so much for joining us here today, Chris, and jumping into the ring of democracy. I just love saying that. And yeah, if you want to take a minute to tell voters why you should be their choice for this position. And yeah, thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you. So once again, I'm Chris Bennett, running for Congress in California's 3rd District. And I'm part of a new generation of leaders that's trying to bring moral clarity and common sense to Congress by prioritizing the things that most of us agree we should already have. So if you want to see affordable housing, if you want to see the enshrining of reproductive and LGBTQ+ rights, if you want to see our dollars being used for things that actually help people instead of hurting them, then please support our campaign for Congress. You can go to bennettforca.com to learn more with our comprehensive platform, and you'll see us out in the street because we are actually doing real grassroots people power building, not just putting a bunch of ads on TV and Facebook.
All right. And thank you again, Chris. This has been The Ring of Democracy, one of our candidate interviews. And thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you stay tuned for some of the other interviews that we'll have rolling out very soon.